wanted to let you know that Dr. Morello-Frosch will speak for half an hour more or less, and after which period we will be moderating a Q&A, as Joanne mentioned, and you can type your questions in the Zoom in the chat room in Zoom. After the presentation, you'll receive a link to a resource page where you can learn more about the topic if interested. Okay, with that in mind, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch received her bachelor's in science and developmental studies, her master's in public health and epidemiology and biostatistics, and her PhD in environmental health science from UC Berkeley. She taught at San Francisco State University and Brown University before returning to Berkeley, ultimately receiving tenure in 2012. She has a dual chair as professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management in the College of Natural Resources and the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley. For over 20 years, her research has examined social determinants of environmental health among diverse communities with a focus on inequality, psychosocial stress, and how these factors interact with environmental chemical exposures to produce health inequalities. I know that sounds like a lot, but she'll explain it better than I can say it. Much of her work has examined this environmental justice question in the context of climate change, ambient air pollution, exposures to environmental chemicals, and effects on fetal growth and developmental outcomes. Recently, she joined 24 experts on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council to provide recommendations and advice to the Biden administration on how to confront current and historic environmental injustices. As a member of the White House committee, she would like to see concrete strategies that integrate sustainability and environmental justice goals into policy, and that improve environmental quality in air, water, access to green space, climate change mitigation, and other areas, particularly focused in communities of color and low-income communities. Dr. Morello-Frosch has received numerous awards for her leadership and expertise in her field as a professor and researcher. She has over 80 peer review articles and sits on the board of multiple nonprofit organizations and editorial board reviews. She is a strong activist for research and solutions to combat breast cancer, a disease that has personally affected her life. Dr. Morello-Frosch currently lives in Berkeley with her husband, David Eifler. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morello-Frosch in today's presentation on the climate gap, inequalities, and how climate change hurts Americans and how to close the gap. Welcome, Dr. Morello-Frosch.
Thank you, Claudia. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to share my screen. And you are muted, Dr. Morello-Frosch.
If I turn it. Oh, why don't you use mine then? Okay, now.
Can you hear me? Give thumbs up if you can hear me.
Nope. Okay. Fine.
If you turn off yours, Claudia, and Rachel turns on hers.
Okay, how are we doing now? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. So as I was saying, I am super excited to talk to you today because, well, A, I love the organization, and B, my students have been the grateful recipients of your scholarships. So I have witnessed how your work has benefited the next generation of, in my case, environmental health scientists and social scientists who are tackling some of the biggest environmental health challenges that we're facing. So can folks see my presentation? I just need a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, so today I want to highlight work related to what we call the climate gap, which is in 2006, which seems like a very long time ago, at a time when the federal government was on the verge of possibly passing a climate change law, which I know is really hard to believe given where we're standing right now. There was a lot of conversation about the international global inequalities and the impacts of climate change. And that is always the subject of conversation, for example, in the UN negotiations that are about to happen again in Glasgow. But at that time in 2006, there had been very little discussion about inequalities within the United States in terms of the disproportionate impacts of climate change on communities of color and the poor. So we released a report called The Climate Gap, which you can still read online, and I'm happy to chat to everybody after our conversation. But basically, we coined this term. It's now ubiquitously used. I even saw it on some of the executive order material and the Biden administration. It's permeated everywhere. So it's very exciting to see that this term really took off. But basically, it encapsulates the extent to which communities of color and the poor are going to be suffering from a health point of view, disproportionately from disease and death related to climate change impacts, whether we're talking about extreme weather events or pollution exposures due to wildfires, and also economic impacts. So poor households are going to be paying a higher proportion of their household income for basic necessities, whether it's food or whether it's your heating bills, et cetera. And then often economic sectors that are very vulnerable to climate change, for example, the tourist industry or food production, where communities of color are disproportionately employed, are also going to suffer disproportionate economic loss. And probably the first time where that really became apparent to us was with Hurricane Katrina. And now we've had so many of these major storms, but Hurricane Katrina really brought the climate gap to a fore in the media in ways that we hadn't seen before. And the disproportionate impacts of these extreme weather events on vulnerable communities who were unable to evacuate, for example, and then many of whom were not able to actually return. So the issues around evacuation had to do with access to transport or not even having a car to get out. And then the other thing that has happened and that I think we often forget about is the ways in which that major storm, Katrina, completely shifted the population of that city and its demographics. It lost almost 30% of its population in the post-Katrina diaspora. 36%, it lost 36% of its Black population and about 16% of its white population. So now these weather events are becoming more frequent. And as we all know, in California, we're experiencing these unbelievably frequent wildfires. Wildfire season is year round, pretty much. We did the first study in California looking at the Southern California wildfire in 2003. So I'm showing you a satellite image here on the right of the smoke plumes coming from these wildfires in the South Coast Air Basin. And we wanted to see the extent to which women who were pregnant and down there during that time, how that affected the birth weights of the babies that were born, because we assumed that they were exposed prenatally. And what we saw was that on average, and I know some of these data in this green circle here, basically what it shows that we looked at effects depending on the trimester of exposure to these wildfire events, then on average, women's babies were about 6 to 10 grams lighter if they happened to be pregnant during that wildfire period. So from a clinical perspective, 10 grams may not seem like a lot, but if you think about large numbers of people being exposed to these major wildfire events, we're talking a 10-gram shift in births, where all of a sudden now the number of low birth weight babies starts to become significant. The other thing that we worry about in terms of why climate change is a women's health issue is another thing that we're studying is looking at the effects of heat waves and major heat events. One study that we did in Harris County, Texas, looked at the effects of an extreme heat wave. And this is a place, Harris County is a place that is very used to hot weather in the summer, just so we know. So people know how to behave when things get super hot. Most households have air conditioning, et cetera. But what we looked at was, to what extent does being exposed to a heat wave increase the risk of having a preterm birth? And so this data that I'm showing you in the red, basically for those of you who get cross-eyed looking at graphs, shows that regardless of how you do your statistical models, that on average, this heat wave was associated with a 10 to 20% increased risk of having a preterm birth, which is a lot, okay? Next, in California, we've also, colleagues of mine in the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is the science branch of Cal EPA, has looked at this in a lot of different ways, again, looking at preterm birth. And the interesting thing here is they also saw that increased risk in the percentage risk of having a preterm birth with every 10-degree increase in mean apparent temperature. But the other interesting thing, and this is why I circle this in red, is this group found increased, even more dramatic effects for Black mothers compared to mothers of other racialized groups. So we can see that in general, women of color, and particularly Black women, the increased risk of preterm birth was higher than it was for their white counterparts, which averaged about 6.6%, and for Black women, it was about 15% increase. So we can see how these major climate events and heat events are bad for women's health, and particularly perinatal outcomes, but we're also seeing that they're worse for women of color and poorer women than their white, wealthier counterparts. So one of the things that we've been looking at, for example, is we are concerned about what we call urban heat island effects, which is in cities. Some of you may notice on a very hot day, probably here in Danville, that depending on where you are, places with a lot of green space and tree shade, the heat is much more tolerable than it is like if you're in a downtown area that's surrounded by lots of cement and buildings and not a lot of shade. And so green space is becoming very important in terms of building climate resilience in communities. And the ability to have great green space requires investments from municipal governments to actually make that green space and make it available in neighborhoods. And so there's a huge disparity within cities in accessibility to green space. And that could be about trees, urban gardens, yards, whatever. And a lot of that has to do with legacies of racism and racist policies that disproportionately affected certain neighborhoods. And so one of the ones that we're studying a lot now is the legacy of redlining. And so during the late 1930s, during the Roosevelt administration and in the wake of the Great Depression, the federal government was trying to save people who were defaulting on their mortgages and to sort of infuse the real estate market and help people bail them out from defaulting on their mortgages, which was a good thing. And so they created the Homeowner Loan Corporation, otherwise known as HOLC. That's the abbreviation that we use for that. And the HOLC was responsible for going to cities and mapping neighborhoods based on their investment risk, okay? And they had all different kinds of criteria for deciding whether or not a neighborhood was a potentially risky investment for mortgage bailouts versus neighborhoods that were likely to be good investments. And some of those criteria were actually quite racist. It had to do with the racial makeup of those neighborhoods. So you can see in the old language of some of these HOLC maps, if you look at these, for example, the proportion of quote unquote Orientals in a neighborhood or proportion of Black people or immigrants would make a HOLC security map designate that neighborhood as having a lower grade. And so the grades were four. You could be an A, a B, or a C, or a D neighborhood. And the D neighborhoods were colored in red, ergo the term redlining. And so there's a beautiful book on this if you want to read about this history called The Color of Law if you want to know more about it. So the reason why I give you this history is because now these redlining maps have been digitized and are available to many of us researchers. And so we can see the extent to which a racist policy that's over 80 years old and is completely illegal now is still exerting its effects on the physical environments that we live in today. In this case, disparities in accessibility to green space, which can protect us from the heat effects of climate change. So in a paper that we published last year, we looking at these Hulk grades, these red line neighborhoods, and how does it relate to the availability of green space in today's neighborhoods. So what you see right now on your screens is on your left, this is the New York metropolitan area. And you can see the colors of the map, the 4 colors, and grades A and B are in blue and green. Those are the good grade neighborhoods. Those are considered places where you want to be investing in mortgage bailouts. Grades C and D being the red line neighborhoods. And those are the neighborhoods that were deprived of mortgage bailouts and other kinds of investments. And you can see that on the map, it correlates very nicely with the map on the right in terms of the greenness of those neighborhoods in the New York metropolitan area. And we did a lot of statistical modeling, not just these descriptive maps, to show that the legacy of these disparities in green space have a lot to do with this historical redlining practice from the federal government. So the beauty of the green space issues, this is something that we can intervene on. We can actually make changes. We can start to try and alleviate those disparities and think more concretely about how we shore up investments in community resilience and provide neighborhoods that have historically been deprived of green space, more accessibility to it, tree planting campaigns and other kinds of things. And we can talk about that at the end. The other issue I want to talk to you about that's near and dear to my heart in California is this issue of oil and gas development. California is undergoing a huge discussion now about the future of oil and gas development regulation in the state. And interestingly enough, until recently, there hadn't really been very many health studies in California about the effects of what we call upstream oil and gas development, meaning that if we're extracting it from the ground, we're focusing less on like the processing, like at a refinery, on health. And yet we know from studies across the country in places like Pennsylvania, Texas, Colorado, where there's been a proliferation of gas development over the last 2 decades, that there's a lot of things about pulling oil and gas out of the ground that can pose health hazards to people who live nearby. It's about air pollution. It's about groundwater contamination and surface water contamination from either the extraction process itself, where we have to inject a lot of chemicals in the ground to get the oil to come up and the gas. A lot of these major oil jacks and towers have excessive light at night, which can really disrupt sleep, which has really big health impacts on people who are affected by that. And then just other social stressors associated with having these facilities nearby you, the truck traffic, which also is a major polluter and very noisy. So we sought to kind of close this data gap in California, and we produced the first study looking at the birth outcome effects of living near active oil and gas production in the state of California. And we looked at over nearly 3 million births over a 10-year period. And just to give you a little context, before 2017, California was the largest oil producer in the country. Now we've fallen to about number 7, but it's still really huge. And the interesting thing about California is a lot of these oil and gas wells are located in rural areas. So if you go down I-5 and you're driving down to LA, you can see a lot of these things in rural areas surrounding Bakersfield. So a lot of it's in the Central Valley, but a lot of it's in LA. In very urban areas, densely populated, people live near these major oil and gas wells. And so this study was the first one to really document what might be the health implications for birth outcomes and for pregnant women. We found that women who live near active oil and gas wells, particularly near high production oil and gas wells, were 40% more likely to have a low birth weight baby, 20% more likely to have a small for gestational age birth. And then in another study done by a postdoc of mine who, when he was at Stanford, he found for oil and gas production in the San Joaquin Valley, that was associated with a 10% increase of preterm birth. And that effect was strongest for Latina moms compared to their white counterparts. And then in another study, when we narrowed it down just to wells where there's kind of an unconventional horizontal drilling method, which is considered potentially more hazardous, or what we call fracking, which is still relatively rare in California. But for those wells where we did see fracking, we saw even stronger effects for those different birth outcomes that I just described to you. So this is an environmental justice issue because there's nearly 3 million, there's over 3 million Californians, about 8% of the population, that lives within 1 kilometer or 3,200 feet of an active oil or gas well in our state. And if you look at this graph, which is a little weird, but I want you to focus on the right side, this is an environmental justice issue because disproportionately, the people who live near these wells tend to be Black. They tend to be non-English speaking households. They tend to be renters, Latino, lower educational attainment level, and more likely to live below the federal poverty line. So again, this is, I think, a policy relevant issue, and that we can start addressing, and that which I'm going to, I have some good news here. I'm not all about bad news. So I want to shift gears because I've given you kind of like a big picture kind of health portrait with a focus on California. But the good news, as many of you know, California has a climate change law. And we passed that legislation first in 2006 under Governor Schwarzenegger. And we renewed it again about 3 years ago. And basically, as you can see, and this is actually a really big deal because we are the 5th largest economy in the world. We did this, we passed these laws at a time when the federal government was just going nowhere with climate change policy. So it was, and we did it with a Republican administration, and then when Democrats became governors, they continued it and continued passing more climate change. So it just, again, it kind of makes me proud of being a Californian, and people have to pay attention to us, even though they think we're a bunch of weirdos. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. So, so just to give you a sense of when the first law was passed, we had pretty ambitious goals to get to about 20% 1990, and we hit that goal actually about a year early. And then since we've renewed the law, we have even more ambitious reduction goals to greenhouse gas reduction goals to get to about 40% our 1990 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 80% below our 1990 emissions by 2050. So it's very ambitious. And yeah, we're trucking along, and it's a challenge, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But the good news is I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we can document some of the short-term health benefits of the climate change law, because I think what often happens when we think about climate change and reducing greenhouse gases, we're always focused on, we want to protect future generations. And sometimes that makes it harder for other people to get on board about, well, this is a lot of cost for future generations. That's sometimes the anti-argument for against climate change policy. So what I want to show you is one of the things that can happen is, when laws are about to get passed, or they get passed, industry sees the writing on the wall and starts to react accordingly. So in the case of California, the power plant industries knew that eventually we were going to pass a climate change law. And so they started doing the math on some of their power plants and realizing some of these power plants are not going to become particularly cost effective. And so they started shutting them down. Some of them, particularly the ones that were dirtiest, the oil generated power plants and a couple coal generated power plants. So a notable one that was shut down in the Bay Area, for example, is the one that was in Bayview Hunters Point. So this allows us data geek epidemiologists to actually leverage what we call natural experiments to look at the potential short-term health benefits of these shutdowns. So here's an example. You have a power plant in Chula Vista. It's predominantly in a low-income community. And then that power plant shuts down. It's essentially is gone, okay? Or at least its emissions is no longer impacting the nearby community. So to what extent can we assess what the impacts are short-term? And in this case, we looked at did it affect the rates of preterm birth and fertility in communities that were living near these plants? So this is a map of California that shows the location of all the plants that retired during a 10-year period. Okay, and the ones in red were coal plants, just so you know. And we looked at, again, we got birth certificates and during the timing before the plants closed, and then for a period of time after the plants closed. And we did what's called a difference in difference analysis, which I'm not going to go through all the data right now. And our question was, to what extent did these closures affect preterm birth and fertility rates among communities living about 5 to 10 kilometers away? And what we found was remarkable. We found that these retirements, on average, were associated with a nearly 2% reduction in preterm births among communities that were living nearby. That means preterm birth rates went from about 7% to about 5% in the post-retirement period. These benefits were stronger for African American and Asian mothers. Again, those are populations that are which I showed you before, appear to be more vulnerable to some of these climate change effects and health effects associated with the fossil fuel industry, for example. So not only are we getting benefits for everybody in terms of perinatal outcomes, we're seeing dramatic effects also for some of the most vulnerable groups, Black moms and Asian moms. And our second study showed that fertility rates also increased in the post-plant period. And I've cited these papers, and we can make them available if you really want to get geeky and dig down into the data. So I just want to put this in context. If we developed a drug that reduced preterm birth by 2%, people would be falling all over themselves to invest in that drug. It would be considered a blockbuster, okay? So this is where kind of these interventions can have a huge impact, because so many people are exposed to the pollution from these sources. And when you remove it, the collective benefit is remarkable. Okay, so let's switch gears again. We have a climate change law. And now, one of the major tools of California's climate change law is that greenhouse gas emitting industries, like in the power industry, major industrial emissions facilities, refineries, cement plants, etc., they used to be able to emit all kinds of greenhouse gases and carbon for free, but now they have to pay under this new regime. It's through what's called a cap and trade system. And basically, industries have to purchase what are called allowance or pollution permits. For every ton of greenhouse gas they emit from their smokestack, they have to have a permit, or what we call an allowance, that is an equivalent of that ton. And every compliance period, they have to do an accounting of their emissions, and they have to show that they have the permits for that. So now industry is paying for what they used to be able to do for free. That money goes into the general fund in California. And so environmental justice organizers said, hey, that's a lot of money going into the general fund. We want to create what's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Legislation was passed, and it basically said that a huge proportion of that revenue from cap and trade needs to go into this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And it needs to be, those monies need to be invested in programs that reduce pollution in disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, communities of color, communities that are disproportionately hosting a lot of these dirty industries. Because with every ton of greenhouse gas that you don't emit, you're also not emitting other kinds of pollutants that we know are bad for your health, like particulate matter, air toxics, other kinds of things. The other part of this greenhouse gas reduction funds says that 35% of the funds have to benefit vulnerable communities. So public transit, green space, all kinds of things. But 20%, and now actually it's higher, it's more like 30%, has to be invested in vulnerable neighborhoods directly, okay? So the question is, how do we find and designate where those communities are, okay? So many of you may be familiar, but if you're not, I encourage you to Google CalEnviro screen. This is something that we collaborated with Cal EPA's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment to develop this mapping tool, which is which gives scores to every census tract in the state of California. And it's based on different kinds of demographics. So proportion communities of color, people living under poverty, unemployment, but also the presence of environmental hazards nearby, air quality, drinking water quality, other kinds of things. And it scores them into a cumulative impact score so that now this is being used as the tool to designate where these greenhouse gas reduction funds are invested to shore up and make communities, environmental justice communities, more resilient around climate change and ensure that the short-term health benefits is improving life for those who need it the most. These are the indicators that go into the map. And again, I'm happy to share these slides with the group if you want to look at them later. But there are indicators of exposure, data on environmental effects, again, has to be available statewide, and then other population characteristics such as rates of asthma, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, and then other socioeconomic factors like I described. And the bundles them up, zips them up into kind of a cumulative impact scores. I showed you that map. This is what is being used to invest greenhouse gas reduction funds. $11 billion have been appropriated to date. You can look at the annual report online to see every year where these funds are being invested. They're going to municipal governments, small community organizations, researchers like myself who have been the beneficiaries of some work, which I'm going to highlight for you in a second. Transit and intercity rail, all kinds of great programs. So if you want a little inspiration about where our cap and trade money is going, I suggest you read these reports, and the profiles of the projects are awesome. So we actually received some research money to develop additional tools to inform resilient strategies for vulnerable communities. This project is called Toxic Tides. And what we're looking at is we're looking at sea level rise threats to potentially hazardous facilities that are located in coastal areas in California. And we're doing this again in collaboration with a lot of the communities that live in these areas and that are more likely to be adversely affected if there's flooding of, for example, a major industrial facility. We've seen, for example, with Hurricane Harvey and other things that when these major flood events happen, areas can become literally toxic soups because some of these facilities are just too very vulnerable to flooding, and chemicals get spilled everywhere and can impact communities nearby. How are we doing? Good. This is a little Giphy thing that I'm showing you, which is this is a prototype of our map, but this is going to go online hopefully by the end of the year. So we have mapped every facility along the coastal areas of California. And you can choose a flood year projection. So I'm showing you 2100. And then the different colors of the circles represents a different kind of facility category. So it could be anything from a power plant to a major dairy or a concentrated animal feeding operation, industrial facility, refinery, etc. And then the size of the circle gives you an extent to which that facility is vulnerable to a major flooding event. So the fatter the circle, the more likely it's going to have a major flooding event during that period, the more frequently it's going to happen. You can click on the facility itself and find out more about it, where it is, what it does, and it'll take you to EPA's website so you can learn more about what's going on. So this is what we hope to make available to folks by the end of the year. That's cool. And then we're also looking at the number of flooding events in a particular neighborhood. And again, providing people information that they can use, including demographic information on the neighborhood itself. So this tool is hopefully going to be used for facility and climate resilience planning into the future by cities, the state, the Oceans Protection Council, as well as local communities and community-based organizations that are trying to organize their own communities around climate resilience strategies. Okay, so I want to leave you with some positive things and some, I was told, what can we do? So here we go, and I've numbered them for you. So the first thing I want to encourage you guys to do is I know this doom and gloom. I know the news cycle is really intense. And then when we're isolated in our houses, it's even more just overwhelming. And doom scrolling, I'm guilty as charged. But we always need to be able to imagine a new future as much as possible. And we need to imagine a future that's sustainable and equitable. That new future, the access to technology, the access to cleaner ways of growing food, and fossil fuel, clean energy standards and clean access to solar needs to be available to everybody. Okay, so we're going to have to move beyond thinking about how each of us is going to put solar on our roofs to how we're going to make solar available to people who live in apartments and in rental homes and other kinds of things. So community-based solar, for example. We need to speak the truth, but when we're talking to our friends and engaging in these sometimes challenging conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner table or the holiday table or wherever, but we also need to do it in a way that minimizes doom and gloom, because people shut down when you do that. Okay, so you always need to keep in mind that, like, yes, it's really intense now, it's overwhelming, but the future really doesn't have to suck. Okay, if we can kind of get it together. And so the way we do that is we have to get inspired and always be reading about the work of others. So the one thing I want to turn you to is a conflict of interest here. I chaired the board of this wonderful environmental magazine called Grist. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at it. They have a thing called The Fix, and they highlight the Grist 50 every year of amazing people who are doing work that address climate change. So this is one way to get in touch and inspired by the work of others. And we have such an interdisciplinary group here that I'm sure you guys will find someone that really inspires you in this list. Artists, business folks, politicians, farmers, academics, everybody is in here. It's amazing. Individual level. Yes, we need to consume less. We need to educate ourselves about where our stuff goes, and where it's coming from, and hopefully just start consuming less, which I know is hard, but it's a good thing to think about. We need to support the dissemination of technological innovation, okay? And yeah, it's going to cost us more money. And yes, people are going to have to pay taxes to make this work. But I think the conversation has shifted around this a little bit, even at the federal level. We'll see what happens, but enough said. But we also need to know the limits of our individual actions, okay? We will not be able to shop our way out of this problem, okay? Individual actions are important. Eating low on the food chain is good, less meat, all these other kinds of things that people want to do, recycling, carpooling, all that stuff. I do it, I think it's great. And if enough of us do it, it has a huge impact. But that alone is not going to solve our problem. So I'm going to chat you this great article that I tweeted about the other day. This is an amazing article from Business Insider that is showing the ways in which industry, particularly those that are climate forcing, have made us think about sort of our individual lifestyle choices are going to make the difference in dealing with this climate change fight. This notion of carbon footprint promoted by BP, okay? So it's not that we shouldn't do these things, but this thing has been way overemphasized to lead us to really just sort of feel guilty and bad and think that if we could just make better lifestyle choices, we can get out of this problem. Lifestyle choices are important, but it's not enough. So we need to push for structural change, okay? And yeah, that means getting out there on the streets, on social media, however we like to do it, going to talks, listening to geeky people like me, organizing talks, and having conversations with your community, okay? And it also means, how do we make connections across different movements? People talk about how Biden's, plate is super full right now between Afghanistan and the Haitian immigrant crisis and the climate change plan and the infrastructure bills, whether or not the Democrats are going to tube our future, et cetera. But if you really sit back and think about it, all these things are interconnected. The refugee crisis right now is it's driven by political violence, but it is also driven by climate change. Rural communities can no longer lead an agrarian lifestyle and feed their families and eke out a living because of climate change. They just can't do it anymore, and that's why they're coming here. People have lost their livelihoods, their homes, due to flooding and these extreme weather events, okay? What is the connection between police brutality and the fossil fuel industry? Well, the fossil fuel industry bankrolls a lot of the police organizations that crack down on these indigenous Key XL pipeline protests that are trying to shut down our dependence on the fossil fuel treadmill, okay? And then this notion of I can't breathe, Eric Gardner, I can't breathe has to also do with the pollution that the fossil fuel industry is disproportionately affecting. Communities are also impacted by police violence. So we got to make those connections. And after we've done those things, I just want to say that change can happen sooner than you expect. So we just had an incredible piece of news that I think fell under the radar last week. The supervisors of LA County voted to end oil and gas drilling in LA County. It is an epicenter of oil and gas development there. Now, there's a lot of caveats. The devil's going to be in the details about how they phase it out. It is mostly in unincorporated areas, but they are going to be trying to shut down the Inglewood oil field, which is the home of a lot of African-American middle class and working class folks. And this is the result of a really long trajectory of environmental justice organizing in that area. So this just happened last week, okay? And again, I want to point to you, yes, we're a bunch of weirdos here in California, but when the 5th largest economy in the world and the most populous area in the state makes a declaration like that, everyone else is going to be starting to take notice. So including the Biden administration. So I'm on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and one of the things that we are charged with doing is helping the administration implement President Biden's executive order on Justice 40. Justice 40 is modeled on California's greenhouse gas initiative legislation, going back to that thing where I showed you that cap and trade monies, a certain proportion of them have to be invested in environmental justice communities. Biden's Justice 40 initiative, that is not a coincidence, okay? Kamala Harris is his vice president. A lot of Californians are now working for the Biden administration. So his executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and the specifics of it, if you read through it, is very much influenced by what we've been doing in California since 2006. So I'm going to leave it there. Love to have a conversation with you. And hopefully I left you on a high note, but just in case, I'm just going to leave that up there for you. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Just terrific. I feel engaged and ready to be more positive for sure. I had thought that we would have to take some questions, a lot of questions around what can I do? What can I do? And you addressed all of that beautifully. Thank you very much. I think we have time for just a couple of questions. So let me just ask you the first more specific things about your data, which was really well done. It took complicated data and explained it for those of us who are smart but not interested too much in the details that you have. So I think we got a lot out of the data. A first question I think is really cool, and it relates to your early on in your presentation about living near gas and oil wells. Living near active, high production oil and gas wells is associated with low birth weights. Why is that? What do you think is behind the low birth weights?
Yeah, so we do know probably one of the main pathways of what it is about oil and gas that might be leading to low birth weight is air pollution. There's a lot of consensus that, for example, PM particulate matter, small particulate matter, or what we call PM 2.5, is definitely associated with a lower birth weight, and that has been consistently shown. So that could be one key pathway. Others are particularly, we saw really strong effects in rural areas of California, and a lot of those communities are reliant upon groundwater for their drinking water sources. So it is possible that another pathway of exposure to contaminants that affect birth weight is through drinking water contamination. We were not able to measure that because we were looking at, nearly 3 million births. But so those, I think, are the key kind of pathways by which we're seeing adverse fetal growth effects associated with living near these oil and gas wells. And these studies have also been done in other states like Texas, Colorado, and Pennsylvania, and we've seen pretty consistent results there too.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question. There's several in the chat, but our timing is such that we need to kind of move on. And we will look forward to the resource page, by the way. And it might be that maybe Claudia could send it to the chat, and then we'll all have access to it, et cetera.
You can do it too.
Also, this is the last question, more general. How do you think that people in the US make a direct connection between climate change, green space, and health? And how can we make that connection more extensive in terms of the population?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so you're talking about green space specifically.
Well, that's what occurred. Yeah, especially in your first data that was so evident.
Yeah, so I think, as we are definitely seeing a huge shift in the number of warm degree days, and also very significantly for us here in the San Francisco Bay Area, number of warm degree nights. So I think people are now, literally recognizing the importance of green space to help, no pun intended, weather those hot events, particularly in places where most of us don't have air conditioning. A lot of people in this area where you guys are probably do, because it does get pretty hot and it always has. But I think people are starting to make those connections as they're starting to realize that it is definitely getting hotter, and those periods of relief are shrinking.
Great. I think it's unfortunate that we have to have the increase right in front of us in our homes, but it's also helpful that we are going to then do something about it. And I think you've given us all kinds of great ideas to do something about it. So because of our time, I'm going to turn it back to Joanne Keano, but I want to for sure thank you from all of us.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be chatting some resources as you guys continue. Okay.
Thank you so very much. And we hope that you'll stay in touch. And anytime you want to join an AAUW, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.